In the heart of a brutal winter storm, a prospector discovers that his only hope of survival lies within a strange and seemingly unremarkable snow pocket. Is it a stroke of luck or an unexpected design of nature that could save him from the harsh elements? His life will depend on this peculiar refuge, and what happens next will leave you questioning everything you know about the wilderness. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if tales of survival and ingenuity like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The wind howled through the forest, its icy breath sweeping across the mountain ridges, carrying with it a biting cold that felt like it could strip the flesh from a man's bones. All around him, the world had turned white. Snow fell relentlessly, a frozen tide that buried everything in its path. Samuel Anderson had seen many storms in his time as a prospector, but nothing like this. His boots crunched in the thick snow as he trudged along the narrow trail, each step becoming more laborious. The blizzard was relentless, and the visibility had diminished to near nothing. What was once a solid path now seemed like a ghostly stretch of white, merging seamlessly with the sky above. His breath came out in short bursts, freezing almost as soon as it touched the air. Samuel had been heading back to camp, but the storm had swallowed his bearings. He couldn't even remember how far he'd wandered off the trail. The faint flicker of light from his lantern was swallowed by the thick snowfall. It felt as though he was walking in circles, but with no landmarks to guide him, there was no way to know for sure. The weight of the snow had already begun to make its mark on his body, his shoulders stiff and his legs growing heavy with exhaustion. He had to find shelter soon. The storm was not just cold, it was brutal, unforgiving. And he knew that if he didn't find cover, the storm would take him. No one survived these conditions for long, not without shelter or fire. Then, through the thick snowfall, Samuel's eyes caught a strange sight. Just ahead, a gap in the snowbank. It wasn't much, just a small pocket, but it was enough to pull him toward it. Desperation pushed him forward as he stumbled toward the opening. He collapsed to the ground, his legs too weak to carry him any further. Inside, the snow formed a small, hollowed-out space, a small cavern of sorts, just big enough for a man to crouch down and shield himself from the worst of the storm. It wasn't much, but it was something. Samuel took a deep breath, wiping the frost from his face, and crawled into the snow pocket. The chill of the wind was still biting, but within the walls of the snow mound, the worst of it was kept at bay. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. As the storm raged outside, Samuel closed his eyes and huddled deeper into the snow, clutching his coat tightly to his chest, praying that the blizzard would pass soon. The hours passed slowly in the snow pocket, each minute a constant battle against the cold. Samuel's teeth chattered and his hands shook uncontrollably. He had no fire, no food, and no way of knowing if he'd make it through the night. The storm continued its merciless assault, burying the world outside in an ever-deepening sea of white. But inside his snow refuge, he could still feel the small warmth his body generated, the only source of heat in this frozen wasteland. He thought of his camp just a few miles away, and the warm fire that would be waiting there. But he was lost now, his sense of direction swallowed by the storm. He would have to wait until the snow let up before he could even think about trying to find his way back. A small part of him, buried deep down, began to wonder if the storm might not be the end of him. He had lived through plenty of hardships, mountain winters, wild animals, the dangers of the wilderness, but never before had he faced something like this. The cold seeped into his bones, gnawing at him, stealing away any energy he had left. Suddenly, a soft sound cut through the howling wind, a light, crunching noise, a shift in the snow. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. At first he thought it was just the storm playing tricks on him, but then the sound came again, closer this time. He tensed, listening. His mind raced, wondering if it was just the wind or something else. The snow pocket offered some protection, but it wasn't perfect. If something, another man, an animal, found him here, it would be a fight to the death. The sound came again, louder now. A soft crunch, followed by a shift in the air as though something large was moving toward him. Samuel's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle, his fingers numbing as they gripped the cold metal. His heart pounded in his chest, each thud echoing in his ears. He had no choice but to wait and see what would emerge from the storm. The snow pocket was his only refuge, but whether it would be enough to keep him safe from whatever was approaching, he couldn't be sure. Samuel's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he pressed himself deeper into the snow, the cold beginning to gnaw at his bones. He could feel his heart pounding against his chest, and every second seemed to stretch into eternity. The noise outside had stopped, replaced by the eerie silence of the storm, its howling winds now muted behind the thick layers of snow. The only sound left was the muffled beat of his own pulse. The rifle, still clutched tightly in his frozen hands, felt like an extension of his very soul in that moment. If whatever was out there meant him harm, he would have no choice but to fight. The snow pocket, however small, was a fragile fortress. He could feel its shape pressing against him, offering some meager protection, but it would not withstand much force. If something large, something predatory, decided to push its way in, this little hollow wouldn't hold. The idea of being hunted sent a chill deeper than the cold itself into his veins. He thought of the animals that roamed these woods, bears, wolves, and cougars, predators that knew how to survive in the harsh wilderness. But more than that, his mind flashed to the stories of men who had been lost in the mountains, never seen again. Those who had met their end not just by the weather, but by the things that called these wilds their home. His eyes darted to the small opening of the snow pocket. The storm raged fiercely outside, but the thick walls of snow around him acted like a blanket, muffling the noise of the wind and hiding the world from view. If he were to move, to make even the slightest sound, he was certain the creature, or whatever it was, would hear him. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Samuel's body began to stiffen from the cold, but he dared not move. Every muscle in his frame ached, and the hunger gnawing at his gut became more pronounced. He had no food in his pack, and there was no way of knowing how long the storm would last. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye, something dark against the white of the storm. For a moment he thought he was imagining it, his mind playing tricks on him in the frozen, sleep-deprived state. But then the shadow moved again, closer now, and his breath caught in his throat. It was unmistakable. A figure moving through the snow, small but deliberate. Samuel's first thought was that it was another man, perhaps a fellow prospector or hunter, who had found himself lost like Samuel. But the way the figure moved was strange, too graceful, too fluid, like a shadow slipping through the night. His heart pounded harder, and his hand tightened around the rifle's stock. The figure stopped just at the edge of his shelter, and for a long moment Samuel held his breath, his mind spinning with possibilities. The storm, his isolation, and the growing desperation were beginning to cloud his judgment. Was it friend or foe? Was it just a figment of his imagination, or had something, or someone, found him in the snow? There was no time to think further. Samuel raised his rifle, the cold metal digging into his hands, his fingers twitching with the weight of decision. His next move would be one that decided whether he lived to see another day, or met the fate of countless others who had ventured too deep into the wilderness. For what felt like an eternity, the figure remained still in the snow, mere feet from Samuel's fragile refuge. Samuel's breath was shallow, his grip tightening around the rifle. His eyes never left the shadow as it seemed to study the snow pocket, or perhaps him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the air thick with the uncertainty of what might come next. As if sensing the tension, the figure shifted, moving cautiously but deliberately closer. Every movement was calculated, precise. There was no rush, no frantic scrambling like that of a frightened animal. This was a slow, measured approach, almost too calm for Samuel's frayed nerves. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a hunter? A lost prospector like himself? Or worse, could it be something more dangerous? A predator that had learned the art of stealth in these unforgiving mountains. A glint of something shiny flashed in the dim light of the storm, perhaps a knife or some other tool of survival. Samuel's mind raced even faster, but still he held his ground. He knew his best chance for survival lay in staying as still and silent as the storm around him. He didn't dare speak, not yet. He didn't know if the figure was friend or foe, and he wasn't willing to take any chances. And then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it stopped. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Was it waiting for something? Or perhaps trying to decide whether it should come closer? A voice, low, gravelly, but unmistakable, broke the silence. "You lost, friend?" The words were cautious, not threatening. There was an odd sense of familiarity in them, as though the man on the other side of the snow wasn't just speaking to Samuel, but also to the storm itself, seeking solace in something steady amidst the chaos of the wilderness. Samuel hesitated. He hadn't expected this. The thought that someone else might be out here, someone just as desperate as him, struck him as both a relief and a danger. For a moment he lowered his rifle ever so slightly, uncertain of how to respond. "I'm fine," he managed to say through gritted teeth, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "Just lost my way." The figure seemed to nod, though Samuel couldn't be sure. The storm made everything appear muffled, as though the world was locked in a dream of white and gray. "I thought I saw smoke," the stranger continued. "Might be better to come with me. I know a place up the way where we can wait out the worst of this." Samuel's pulse raced. Could he trust this man? The way the stranger moved, the careful tone of his voice, everything about him seemed to have the hallmarks of someone who knew the wilderness well, who knew how to survive the worst that nature could throw at a person. But that didn't mean he was safe. The world was full of men who would take advantage of a lost soul. Samuel didn't have the luxury of trusting easily. Still, the thought of warmth, food, and safety, something beyond the cold walls of his snow pocket, was too tempting to ignore. "Lead the way," Samuel said, his voice still rough from the cold. His body ached with the need for rest, but he was not so naive as to believe he could survive much longer on his own. The figure gave a slight nod and turned, his footsteps crunching in the snow as he led Samuel into the storm. The storm whipped around them, a relentless force that seemed determined to bury everything in its path. Samuel followed. The figure through the snow, each step heavy and uncertain, the weight of the storm pulling him further into its cold embrace. The world around him had turned into a swirling sea of white, the ground beneath his feet slick and treacherous. His mind struggled to grasp the direction they were heading, but the stranger moved with ease, his every step calculated, unfazed by the harsh conditions. Samuel's body ached with every movement, his muscles stiff from the cold, the exhaustion slowly creeping in. He had lived through winters before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt so consuming, so unrelenting. The storm seemed to stretch on forever, but the stranger was resolute, leading Samuel forward without hesitation. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound, the crunch of their boots in the snow, and the howl of the wind. Samuel kept his eyes trained on the figure ahead of him, watching the stranger's movements carefully. He was trying to make sense of everything, the man, the strange pocket in the snow, and the promise of safety that the stranger offered. But a part of him remained wary. The wilderness was a cruel master, and nothing was ever as it seemed. The thought of turning back crossed Samuel's mind more than once. He had no idea who this man was or what his true intentions might be. But there was no turning back now. The storm had already swallowed up the path they had come from, and the only way forward was with the stranger. He couldn't afford to waste energy second-guessing himself. He had to trust, at least for now. "Not far now," the stranger's voice broke through the Samuel's thoughts, a low murmur against the roar of the storm. Samuel nodded, though the words seemed to carry little weight. How could anyone know how far they had traveled in the blinding snow? Still, there was something about the stranger's calm demeanor that offered a strange sense of reassurance. Minutes, or was it hours, later, they came to a halt. The stranger stopped in front of a large, snow-covered rock outcrop that seemed to blend seamlessly with the landscape. For a moment, Samuel thought it might be just another illusion in the storm, but then he saw the faint outline of a small opening at its base. The stranger crouched down and, with a few swift movements, cleared away the snow from the entrance. "There's a shelter inside," the man said, his voice now sounding more grounded, as if this was a place he had known for some time. Samuel felt a rush of relief mixed with wariness. He didn't know what to expect beyond that opening, but the idea of shelter, real shelter, was too tempting to resist. He followed the stranger into the small, dark, cave-like space, and immediately the temperature seemed to shift. Inside, the air was warmer, less bitter than it had been outside. The man gestured for Samuel to sit, and he did so gratefully, his legs trembling from the exertion and cold. His eyes adjusted to the dimness of the space, and he could see that the shelter was simple but functional, barely enough room for two men, with a small fire pit at the far end. Sheltered from the wind and snow, it was a small oasis in the vast wilderness. "Sit tight," the stranger muttered as he moved toward the fire pit. "I'll get the fire going." Samuel didn't argue. His hand shook as he pulled off his wet gloves and rubbed them together, grateful for the warmth, even if only for a moment. His thoughts drifted to the strange turn his journey had taken, how the snow pocket had saved him, and how this man had appeared from nowhere to offer him refuge. There was a fire now, crackling softly in the corner of the shelter. The warmth from the flames seeped into Samuel's chilled bones, and for the first time in what felt like days, he allowed himself to relax, even just a little. The warmth of the fire was a welcome relief, the heat slowly working its way into Samuel's stiff muscles as he sat on the rough ground, staring into the flames. The stranger, now kneeling beside the fire, was methodically adding small pieces of wood to the crackling flame. The rhythmic sound of the firewood snapping and popping filled the silence between them, but Samuel's mind was far from at ease. He had a million questions swirling in his head, but he couldn't bring himself to ask them yet. There was something about the stranger that felt off, like he was hiding something. The man's calm exterior was almost too perfect, too controlled for someone who had just emerged from a storm of this magnitude. Samuel had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and something about this situation didn't sit right with him. Breaking the silence, the stranger spoke, his voice soft yet clear in the quiet of the shelter. "You're probably wondering who I am." Samuel stiffened, but he didn't answer. The stranger didn't need a response, it seemed. He simply continued. "I've been out here for longer than I care to admit," the man said, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the flames. "I came to the mountains years ago looking for gold, like everyone else. But you don't stay long in these parts unless you've got a deep reason for it." Samuel felt a flicker of curiosity, but still he didn't speak. The man's story seemed familiar, a prospector with a dream, chasing something that was always just out of reach. But there was something in the way the stranger spoke, a weariness in his voice that hinted at something deeper. The stranger paused before continuing, his gaze now shifting to Samuel, as though weighing the decision to share more. "I've seen things out here," he said, his voice growing quieter, "things you can't unsee. The wilderness doesn't care about us, doesn't owe us anything. The storms, the predators, the cold, it all takes. And sometimes it takes more than you can give." Samuel's brow furrowed. Was this man speaking from experience, or was there something else to his story? "What do you mean?" Samuel asked before he could stop himself. The stranger's eyes locked with his, and for a long moment there was a tense silence. Then the man finally spoke again, his voice grave. "I've lost everything, friends, family, But it's not the storm that kills you out here. It's the things that linger in your mind after, the loneliness, the quiet death of hope. Samuel stared into the fire, his thoughts turning inward. He had been on his own for a long time, but he had never thought of the wilderness that way. He had always seen it as something to be conquered, something to endure. But now, in the quiet of the shelter, with the fire crackling between them, he realized there was a different kind of survival out here. A survival of the spirit, not just the body. The man's story lingered in the air, heavy with meaning, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that it was leading somewhere. What had this man truly lost out here, and what was it he had found in the mountains that had brought him to this place? The fire crackled between them, its warmth soothing the biting cold that had lodged itself deep into Samuel's bones. Outside, the storm raged on, but in the small shelter, the fire provided a false sense of peace. Samuel's mind drifted as the stranger's words lingered in the air. The wilderness was a ruthless place, not just physically but mentally. It gnawed at a man's spirit until he wasn't sure what was real anymore, or what was worth fighting for. The stranger shifted, his eyes fixed on the fire, as though the flames held the answers to the questions Samuel couldn't bring himself to ask. He looked like a man who had lived through countless winters, each one chipping away at something inside him, leaving behind only a shell of who he once was. "I've spent more winters out here than I care to count," the stranger spoke again, his voice almost a whisper, as if he were confiding in the fire itself. "The gold doesn't matter anymore, the riches, the glory, it's all a lie. What the mountains give you is time, time to think, to remember, or to forget." Samuel swallowed hard. There was something raw and open in the man's words, a vulnerability he hadn't expected. He had thought the stranger would be hardened, a man who had embraced the wilderness as his only true companion. But now it seemed the mountains had taken something from him. Goyim, something far more valuable than any treasure. "I lost my family," the stranger continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I came out here to escape. Thought I could outrun the memories. But the mountains, they don't let you escape. They just force you to face everything you've been running from." Samuel felt a pang in his chest. He had known loss, too. His own family, scattered to the winds by time and distance, was never far from his thoughts. But this kind of grief was different. The stranger's words seemed to echo in his own heart, reminding him of things he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. "You think you're running toward something out here," the stranger continued, his voice low and full of pain. "You think you'll find freedom or gold or some kind of peace. But the wilderness doesn't give you any of that. It takes everything. It strips you down, leaves you with nothing but your own thoughts. And when you're left with nothing, you start to wonder if there's anything worth going back to." Samuel's chest tightened. He had heard this kind of talk before, from men who had given up everything to search for treasure or glory in the mountains, only to realize too late that the cost was far too high. But what did it mean for a man to lose hope in everything? What did it mean to live in a place where even the idea of return felt like a distant dream? The fire crackled, and for a moment, the silence between them seemed heavy with unspoken words. Samuel wanted to ask more, wanted to know more about the stranger's past, about the pain that had brought him here. But there was something in the man's eyes that made him hesitate, something that told him he wasn't ready to hear the rest of the story. Instead, Samuel leaned back, his eyes closing as he let the warmth of the fire seep into his aching muscles. There was still a long way to go, still a storm to weather, but for the first time since the blizzard had begun, Samuel allowed himself a moment of quiet. And in that stillness, he realized something he hadn't before. The wilderness didn't just take from a man. It gave too. It gave the opportunity to confront the past, to reckon with the choices that had led them here, and maybe, just maybe, to find a way forward. The storm outside had slowed, its fury now a distant memory, replaced by the soft whistling of wind through the trees. The fire in the shelter burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Samuel sat in the quiet, his thoughts swirling like the snowflakes that had fallen so relentlessly just hours before. The stranger was still next to the fire, staring into the flames as though the answers to his life could be found there. But Samuel knew better. There were no easy answers out here, only the struggle to survive, to keep moving forward despite the odds. "Are you going to stay out here?" Samuel asked suddenly, the question slipping from his mouth before he could stop it. He wasn't sure what made him ask. Perhaps it was the weight of the stranger's grief that had begun to feel like a burden between them, or maybe it was the knowledge that he, too, was facing a crossroads. The stranger's gaze shifted from the fire to Samuel, his face unreadable. There was something in his eyes, something that flickered, like a fleeting moment of doubt. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same weary resolve. "I've been out here too long," the stranger said slowly. "Maybe longer than I should have been. The mountains, they offer a kind of peace, but it's not the kind of peace you're looking for. It's a peace that comes at a cost, and I'm not sure I can keep paying that price." Samuel felt a chill in the air, despite the warmth from the fire. It was a coldness that went deeper than the physical. It was the cold of a man who had given up on hope, who had decided that living in the wilderness was easier than facing what he had left behind. "You don't have to stay," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady. "You don't have to keep running. The mountains might have taken something from you, but they don't have to take everything. You can still walk away from this. You can still find something to hold on to." The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Samuel wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then the man sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Maybe you're right," the stranger said, his voice soft but thoughtful. "Maybe it's time to leave this place behind." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He didn't know if the stranger was speaking out of desperation or if he truly believed there was something more beyond the mountains, something worth fighting for. But in that moment, something shifted. The air in the shelter seemed to lighten, as if the weight of the wilderness had lifted, even if just for a moment. The stranger stood slowly, stretching his stiff limbs as he gazed out at the opening of the shelter. "I think it's time to move on," he said, his tone firm now, as though he had made his decision. Samuel nodded, his heart beating a little faster. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he believed that there was a way forward, a way out of the wilderness that didn't require giving up hope. Together they stood, ready to face whatever lay beyond the storm. The wilderness might have tried to break them, but it hadn't succeeded. Not yet. The first rays of dawn peeked through the opening of the shelter, casting a soft golden light across the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered in the form of a frozen world, silent, still, and untouched. Samuel and the stranger stood at the entrance, both feeling the weight of the moment. "It's strange," the stranger said quietly, looking out at the untouched snow. "After all this time, to think of leaving, like you're walking away from something you've become." Samuel glanced at him, the quiet determination in his eyes reflecting the same pull of the wilderness that had once held him in its grip. Sometimes walking away is the only way forward. The stranger nodded, but didn't speak for a moment, lost in thought. Then, with a final deep breath, he turned toward Samuel, his face resolute. "We'll find a way through this," the stranger said. "Together, maybe. There's more out there, more than the mountains can take." Samuel didn't need to ask what he meant. There was a whole world beyond the wilderness, one that still held promise, even if it was uncertain. They began their journey through the snow-covered forest, their footprints the only sign of life in the vast expanse. The wilderness no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply part of the world they had to face together. The storm had tested them, but it had also given them a new purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. As they walked, the air grew lighter with each step, the weight of the storm and the past slowly lifting from their shoulders. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, There was a sense of hope between them. The stranger looked over at Samuel, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You know," he said, "maybe there's a place for both of us in this world outside of the mountains." Samuel smiled back, the tension easing from his chest. "Maybe. But for now, I'm just glad to have found someone to walk with." The two men walked side by side, the vast wilderness behind them and the unknown stretching ahead, a place where new possibilities awaited. They were no longer lost in the storm, but walking toward something better, something they couldn't yet name, but both could feel. And in that moment, as the sun rose higher, they knew that no matter what the future held, they had survived. And in the end, survival, in all its forms, was the truest form of victory.